Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description notes below the video where you will find links to all of my online shenanigans, including how to get my patterns to knit up for yourself, how to join the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, how to support me on Patreon, and where to get Watch Barbara Knit merchandise. Today, I'm going to be doing a little bit of chatting with you. I'm still working on getting my setup. I got one light up, which I'm going to see once this is done, if that has improved. I had to do a little bit of editing to last week's video. I had to brighten it and do some contrast things because it was a little underlit. We'll see if this has helped. If it still hasn't worked, I can probably dig out another light and we'll just keep playing. I figured out why things were reversed, and I have flipped the camera in a way. So hopefully now, if I don't have anything to show you actually in this video, but if I were to hold up something that had writing on it, then hang on. Here we go. It will actually be correct as opposed to backwards. So I figured that out. Yay me. I am not the tech person. And so that is a little bit of progress. I still haven't found the right sticky things to make this less boring, but we will get to it. Maybe I can get some of those mixed tiles. I could do those. You know, the ones that you just tell them to print and you stick them on the wall? That would work. But what we're going to talk about today is inspiration. This is something that honestly, whenever I've heard a creative person talk, this is the question that is almost invariably asked of the person. Where do you find your inspiration for your creative creations? And I've heard a lot of feedback or people making comments about my move, saying that they were looking forward to seeing what new inspiration my new environment might spur me towards. And you know what? I'm curious to see if my new environment does give me new inspiration. I'm not saying it's not going to, but I wanted to talk about how when anyone asks about inspiration, this is a challenging question for me personally to answer, because the way that I am inspired and the way that I approach the creative process, I don't think is, I think it is atypical. I do not think it is the way many other creatives approach things. I've always said that I approach creativity with a very analytical brain. I don't know that I have the creative brain. I have a very, very analytical brain, but I use it for creative things. Now, that doesn't mean I'm good at math and geometry and things like that, but it's just the way I approach things is, it's not like what you think of as creative. So to start off with, what I can say is where I don't find inspiration. I personally, my creative process is not going to be me seeing a really cool piece of architecture or bridge or detail or any number of things. Now, I'll see them and I'll find them incredibly interesting and I'll take pictures of them, but they will not spur me towards design. I don't see things like that and think, ooh, how can I pay homage to or mimic this in design? That's just not the way my brain works. I don't go on nature walks and see beautiful nature things and think, ooh, if I could only recreate this vignette in a way that would evoke this. My brain, it doesn't work. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go, ooh, pretty, and take pictures of it and then end up spending 15 minutes kneeling beside a rotting log looking at tiny, tiny, tiny mushrooms. And that is what I am going to be doing there. But none of that is really typically going to translate into design, into my knitwear design. It might translate into my painting. I've been doing watercolors, but it's not going to translate into knitwear design for me. I'm not going to look at an existing piece of fashion, either in a store or online or anything. I'm not going to look at that, and I'm not going to be inspired by that piece of fashion and think, ooh, I could take this element and move it this. That's just not. So all of those things that are typically the answer of where do you find inspiration are not the answer for me. And in thinking about trying to talk to y'all in this video, and this is very reflective of my analytical mind, I could break it down into 3 different categories. See, analytical, 3 things, 3 categories. And it is the thing that inspires me, the thing that drives my design is typically either the yarn itself, technique, or concept. And first I'm going to start with concept because it really is the most sort of abstract. And that is, I will come up with an idea of something that I think needs to exist first. And it's going to be something kind of abstract. And really, my very first design, my very first shawl, is reflective of that, in that it was like, I want a shawl. I'm going to design a shawl inspired by the House Atreides from the Dune novels. And so that's the inspiration. The novel is the inspiration. And I have a lot of that. And again, I get a lot of inspirations from these more intellectual things. And it's like, okay, I want to do this. And so then what I did is I went in and looked at and did research on all the different symbology and colors, etc., 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 that represent House Atreides, and ended up with what I ended up with. I ended up with a shawl, and it's really, a lot of times there's a lot of, I try to describe, sometimes people say like their train of thought or their train of inspiration gets derailed. My inspiration, my brain is not a train, it's a pinball machine. And ideas just bounce around and run into all different kinds of things, and eventually it goes down the drain and I end up doing something. So concept is one of those things. I have a ebook called One Stitch, Two Stitch. And again, it's the concept. It was, what can I do with stitch patterns that are only 2 stitches wide? Because I had become fascinated with just the very simple things you can do with just repeated 2-stitch types of motifs. What that ended up becoming was an entire ebook that was a small stitch dictionary with, I think, 14 different 2-stitch patterns, and then 4 different patterns that you could, that was written in kind of a generic way or a building block way, where you could take any of those stitch patterns and stick them into the knitting patterns. So that was a concept. And so each of the elements, each of the patterns that were in there were framed and dictated by that concept. So it's one of these overall kind of things where it's just, my brain has gone, what if we did X? This is a concept, or this is an idea. So it just comes out of nowhere. I really can't tell you where it comes from. It'll just be like, I'm working on something and I'll go, wow, it's amazing what you can do with 2 stitches, and it just snowballs from there. So concept is one place. And again, it's a very, very abstract place where my inspiration comes from. Now, the next one would be technique. And what I mean by technique is, again, the easiest example is my first book. It is Mosaic and Lace. It is taking the technique of slip stitch color work and the technique of lace and putting those two together and seeing what happens when those two things interact and collide with each other and what different fabrics can be created. And these types of projects require a lot of swatching. Lots and lots and lots and lots of swatching. And it's very much what is going to happen with this technique when I manipulate it. I have played with cables and slip stitches, but there's someone else who did it much better than I did. It was on my list of things to do, and then someone else started doing it amazingly, and I was like, good, I don't have to do that. That person has it under control. But I've done a couple slip stitch cable-y types of things, and I've played with slip stitches just in solid, not in color work, and you can do fun things. So slip stitches are a big thing for me. But any kinds of techniques. Another piece that is a really good example that would be a technique thing is my cowl Hazy Shades, where I had this idea of, and again, comes a lot back to Mosaic, because Mosaic just makes my brain light up like a holiday decorations, just bleep. And it was the idea of taking the concept of Mosaic, so like slip stitches to create the color work, and combining it with the technique of holding a fingering weight yarn with a mohair yarn. But what I did is I held it with a mohair yarn of a different color, and I would do some stitches with them held together, and then some stitches with the mohair stranding behind the slipped stitches of the solid. So I was doing Mosaic, but my two colors were the fingering and mohair held together, or the fingering by itself. Those were the two colors. So it was kind of a hybridized slip stitch color work, and it made a really, really interesting effect that I enjoyed, and I probably will play with that some more. And that was very much a technique. What can I do with this particular technique that is in my brain, this idea that I had? And that also moves into the third area where I get inspiration, which is yarn. That technique, that pattern could not exist without the mohair. Well, I mean, you could also do it with any of the very, very thin fuzzy yarns. There are silk alpaca blends that would work in that pattern also, but it's that specific type of yarn and this was a multicolor yarn with a solid light color, so it would have a high contrast. But yarn can very much drive my design. And my swatch labs. You've probably watched some of my swatch labs. My swatch labs are part of that I take a yarn and I'm like, I want to work with this yarn. This is my inspiration. This particular yarn, this is what we're going to be doing. And I put it through its paces. I knit it in lace, I knit it in solid, I knit it in garter, I knit it in cables. I see what that yarn wants to be, what that yarn likes and doesn't like. And I'm not saying it's good or bad yarn, it's just yarns have things they like to do and things that they're like, nah, I'll pass. So they're like, nope. And that, understanding the yarn, getting to know the yarn, and figuring out what that yarn wants to be will drive my design. And once I've figured out how to best highlight that yarn, what techniques, that's when I'm going to dive into my stitch dictionaries and look through them and try to find couple different stitches, maybe combine a couple stitches together, do any number of things to figure out how to make this yarn like achieve its happiness the best that it can. So it's very, very yarn driven. And my second book was very yarn driven. It had technique because it was specifically lace, but all of my design process with that was figuring out which yarn I was going to use and then figuring out what lace worked in that yarn. And again, my second book, it was about lace worked in bulky yarns. How do bulky yarns and lace patterns get along? And talking to that yarn and finding out what elements of lace it was willing to play with was a huge part of my design process in that. And the funny thing is, oftentimes the very last thing in my design process, the very last thing that I do before I write the pattern and sit down to knit that sample, is figure out what thing it's going to be. Because up until that point in time, it's been technique, it's been concept, it's been yarn, it's been swatching, and I've been working in little squares and maybe rectangles or who knows. But at some point, it's like, okay, this has to be a shawl, this has to be a cowl, this has to be a hat, this has to actually be something because people actually want to make something. And it might come as a surprise that that final step, that final decision as to, is this going to be X, Y, or Z accessory, is really the last thing I decide in a design. Because for me, it is the least interesting element of the process. And I know that that sounds a little bit wacky, but it's just the way my knitting works, and it's just the way my brain works. Now, I'm not saying that I don't care what it becomes, and I'm not saying it's not important what it becomes. It's just, it's not the number 1, 2, 3, or 4 thing that I'm thinking about when I am designing what it's going to be. I very rarely sit down and say, I'm gonna design a shawl. Unless it's been requested. Now, a lot of these ideas can be completely circumvented if I've had a specific request. If I'm working with usually a yarn dyer who's like, we need a cowl, or we need a shawl, or we need a whatever, I am ecstatic when I get that kind of approach, because then I don't even have to think about it. Then I already know what it's going to be, and I can put that into the hopper of what I'm trying to figure out, making the sausage. I don't have to like think about it. I don't have to like really worry about it. Because it's already been decided. And since for me, it's not high up on the importancy list, it's great for me when somebody else makes that decision, because that is just brain power that I can use for other decisions that I need to make. So it's just one of those things. I'm like, yay, one less thing to decide, because it really, my creative process is kind of perpendicular to everyone else's. I don't know. Maybe a lot of other people work this way. I simply don't know. But that is why answering the question, where do you draw inspiration, is really challenging for me specifically, because it doesn't come from any place normal. It doesn't come from the places that people would think. Now, influences. You can definitely see influences. Most of my work, if you look at it, is heavily influenced by Art Deco and Art Nouveau, just the aesthetic of it. And it's simply that that's what I find attractive. So you're going to see a lot of swoops and curves and movement, and even my color choices are often swayed by those decorative elements. But I'm not ever really like looking at Nouveau art and thinking, I'm going to try to reproduce this. It just kind of seeps in because that is my personal aesthetic. So, okay. Was that all? Oh my goodness. So that is what I wanted to talk to y'all about, is about inspiration. Now, might I get new and interesting inspiration here in Seattle? I certainly hope so. It may significantly change how I design, or it may just nudge it in directions I haven't gone before, specifically living in a colder climate. And I'm not going to know until it actually starts getting colder. Living in a colder climate might actually have a significant impact on what I want and need to knit. I've always said that I'm really not into brioche because brioche creates a double thick fabric. And I didn't need anything double thick in Atlanta, and I definitely didn't need anything double thick in Florida. Up here, I might need double thick things. And brioche is really full of some really interesting techniques, so it might grab my attention. Who knows? So, this has just been me babbling about this. I really hope that this might have spurred some questions. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to answer them. I figured out, I think next week is, I'm going to double check. I need a mouse pad. My mouse does not roll. So next week is the last week of the month. So I am going to work on doing a live on Thursday like we normally do. And I'm thinking I'm going to keep it at 7 Eastern time, which will be 7654 for me, but we'll figure it out. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.